in 1583 when we were both doing witch hunts in Scandinavia. We were a duo. Peter's going to be talking today to us today about a riff on or am I stealing your thunder?
No, it's good.
A riff on a film that's made collaboratively by Lars von Trier and Leonard, Die Beatspin, or the 5 obstructions. Here we've only got 3 obstructions, right, which makes it a lower barrier to jump over, but also with less time that von Trier gave Leonard. So the 3 obstructions, improvements in analysis and interface for multimodal retrieval. Without further ado, join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim, and everybody else here at UC Berkeley, and especially BIDS for organizing this great series of days for us all. It's been really helpful even already seeing the great work that's going on, and I know we're seeing even more throughout this week. What I want to do today is to talk about a TV show, which I'm actually first curious who in the room has seen The Kingdom. And wait, not the Stephen King Kingdom, the original Danish Kingdom. Raise your hand if you've seen The Kingdom. Okay, Tim, the Danes, right? Okay, this is good. You'll be fresh territory. How to describe The Kingdom? We'll try to describe it a couple different ways. It's been thought of as absurdist supernatural horror. It is done, as Tim said, by some of these folks in the dogma movement. Lars von Trier, was perhaps the most famous. Really, it's a product of the 90s. And like a lot of European interesting shows, it was done in these sort of fits and bursts. I'm not going to look too much at 2022. I'm mostly interested in 1990s. And we'll see a couple images from 2022. And the Danish title is Riget, which just is a sort of a shortening of the word for the National Hospital or the Hospital of the Realm. And it works in Danish as both a shortening of that hospital's name, but also it does mean literally the kingdom. And how to describe The Kingdom? I think the best way to think about it for the Americans in the room is who here watches Murder, She Wrote? Right, because, Joel Lansbury. But then who's played Silent Hill? Right, okay, there we go. And then just put that together with The Office. And this triptych really, I think, kind of captures everything going on in The Kingdom. You've got a cozy murder mystery, you've got gore and dismemberment in hallways, and then you've got extraordinarily banal office politics. And those are the 3 elements that I think von Trier is working with consistently throughout this show. It is not quite dogma, it's slightly before dogma, and for those of you who aren't film scholars, we can ask ourselves how well does really adhere to the rules of dogma, the quote-unquote rules of dogma, which are designed to be broken. It does use a lot of handheld shaky cameras. It is filmed not really on sets, it's filmed in sort of parts of the hospital. It is filmed with natural lighting, albeit with a lot of effects, a lot of kind of color grading. It's supposed to only include diegetic sound made on the stage as they were doing it in the hallways. There's a lot of sound effects in The Kingdom, so perhaps not quite that. Another rule about dogma is there's not supposed to be any murders. And unfortunately, this is where we have an issue with these particular rules. I want to talk a little bit about why this TV show was set in the Hospital of the Realm and talk a little bit very quickly about social welfare state in Scandinavia. The 2 articles to read here are probably Tim's from 2001, where he thinks about kind of ghost stories and the supernatural in the context of a sort of rationalist welfare state. And there's also a wonderful book from Tue Nexø in Danish about testimony from the welfare state. And the notion here is really that you're examining, especially in the 1990s, a kind of moment of a crisis of confidence in the rationalist, sort of functionalist 1930s through 1960s high points of the social democracy of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. The brutalist 1970s building is kind of like peak social democracy. And what we're dealing with now is a building that's kind of falling apart. And so that's an element of the kingdom, is this notion of where is it set, what's supposed to be going on here. This is like the Sloan Kettering in Denmark. This is the best place in the world for medical care. So we've actually seen some great work already today with multimodal models. And I'm at this point in this project where I'm not yet using multimodal models. I'm trying to get my ideas straight before I use those. So I was kind of inspired by the stuff we've seen so far already. But I wanted to show you guys a little bit of work in pre-multimodal models, although I guess you could say some of it is kind of involving both text and image. So one of the things I like to do when I consider culture, whether it's text or image or movies or whatever, is to really kind of zoom out and think about it in sort of a macroscopic perspective. And so what we're looking at here is about 10,000 screen captures from all 3 seasons of the Kingdom. And if you click in here, you'll just see basically shots of, this particular TV show. But right now, there's really no rhyme and there's really no reason in what we're seeing. This is all just kind of sequential. And what we'd really like to do is to figure out a way to kind of reorganize this according to visual similarity. Just using the semifinal layer of a convolutional neural network. Again, some really old technology from like 2016 or so, 2012 even. And so what we've got now is got sort of natural groupings. Everything here is kind of set in an office with Venetian blinds behind it. Everything over here includes men in suits, generally. And so although we're not using the final layer of the network, which would respond to something like suits, this isn't an attempt to categorize or label. We're using the semifinal layer, and of course that's trained to produce labels. But there's actually some cool neighborhoods here. Anybody who's seen the Kingdom knows that some of the most interesting folks, actually probably the smartest and most normal people in the entire hospital, are 2 employees with Down syndrome who work in the basement washing all the dishes. And that is actually clustered here very easily without us having to do facial recognition or anything like that. They're kind of like a Greek chorus passing judgment on the sort of fools on the other floors of the hospital. We can also do other things. We can sort of think about like, well, how do each of all these episodes cluster in and of themselves? And so here are the various episodes. And what's kind of cool is that if I hover over this, let me make these a little bigger so it's a little more visible. When I hover over for example, the empty hallways or the operating rooms, you can see that the red dots are dancing. That's where these clusters are sort of happening within the internal logic of the episodes and the seasons. I could get the same thing going on by just collapsing Leah into like an entire cluster in a grid. And then what I could do is sort of show you that same pattern throughout there. So you can probably see faintly the red dancing throughout. But the point here is that even a really old non-multimodal model is helpful in figuring out, like, can we find all the scenes that are in the operating room or things like that. We also could do our first multimodal model here would be clip search, which is, of course, contrastive language, something with pre-training. And for there, we could just take these same 10,000 particular images. And what we could do is we could type the word coffee. And then theoretically, every image I would get, every screen cap, these screen caps for every 5 seconds, would include, I would say, coffee adjacent imagery. Not guaranteed to be coffee, but it should be in the coffee cinematic universe. And to prove to you that this is actually a multilingual model, we can type the Danish word for cafe and we get some of the same things. In fact, even including this is when Buddha goes around trying to invite all the ghosts to a coffee pause. So it's getting that. It's sort of learned OCR accidentally. We can also do things with scary, close your eyes if you don't like scary. We can do things with elevator, it's snagging the elevators. Love is always very interesting, right? There's, of course, this literal heart. There's like a literal heart. So it's gotten this ability to kind of think about this and produce even things as banal as meetings. So that's our kind of intuition that these screen caps, so far we're not really thinking about sort of narrative. We're not really thinking about scenes yet, but we know that the pixels are responsive to a whole bunch of models we could be giving them. And of course, now we're on this cusp of, as we've seen with Peter Broadwell's work, and we're going to see with the folks from Richmond, Taylor and Lawrence, and David Bamman's work, the promise of these multimodal models. So they're going to understand not just pixels, but they're going to understand something about the sound and the music and the pose. We really want to use these multimodal embeddings to create cross-modal embeddings, to create sort of vectors for surprise across both sonic and visual and textual domains, and sort of align them the same way that Clip does with text and images. We have a lot of questions around this. We're trying to figure out how well do these models understand progression and causation in narrative cinema. It's a good question. How are they actually working under the hood, so to speak. I've been playing around with multimodal models since about 2024, and does anybody recognize these people? Does anybody recognize any one of these people? It's John Scully in the middle. These are the executives of Apple Computer in the 1990s. So what you could do, you could take a multimodal model, I think from mainland China. Back in 2024, you could say, okay, standard evaluation question. These people are forming a death metal band, and what is their name of their band? And if the model is working correctly, it will come up with a death metal band that responds not to my prompt in the sense of these are executives. It'll understand that they're corporate executives by reading the language of the suits and the ties, and perhaps the race and the gender, who knows. So the notion of the echoes of the boardroom or the forsaken executives, this is in response not just to my prompt, it's in response to the pixels that have been given it as an input. Pushing this forward to narrative cinema, so anybody recognize Walkabout, sort of set in Australia, British director. I was really worried about giving a scene from Walkabout to M. Blug Owl. What is it going to say? Luckily, it sort of said the right thing, which is that it's unexpected that somebody would be wearing this British public school uniform in the middle of the desert. And then, of course, we can take the seventh seal and ask it to say, what is interesting here? What is unusual? Why, why should we pay attention to this scene? So these are very primitive models by the standards of 2026. But even back then in 2024, these models were showing some visual comprehension, I would say. I will say one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about is when we're asking these multimodal models for information, what context do we give it? What kind of information do we ask it? I was playing around with a VLM or a multimodal model for and I found that I was adjusting my system prompt to say things like, hey, this is in the 1990s, it's set in a hospital, spooky things are happening, just tell me what's going on. And that prompting triggered a sort of sycophantic response from, actually this is Qwen 3 VL, which is a newish model, very high quality. And it would just describe everything as being really scary. And that was because my system prompt was corrupting sort of what it was thinking. It was the sycophantic bias. There are other limitations in multimodal models. When you look into the architecture, you might end up with understanding that it sort of looks a lot more like this car, the 7-Eleven, than you might hope. We're sampling frames every couple seconds, and like it's trying to kind of infer. It's less a filmic narrative understanding of what's going on, and more kind of a kind of I can't believe this works architecture, sort of like RAG. But that didn't stop us from giving Qwen 2.5 VL in 2025 both a video recording of a performance by Carolee Schneemann, a sort of pioneering feminist conceptual artist, as well as an interview with her. Funny story about Qwen 2.5 VL, it did not have audio understanding. So it could understand this was Carolee Schneemann, not because she said, my name is Carolee Schneemann, it's because there was a lower third, a chiron that said Carolee Schneemann, it could read that. Qwen 3, I believe, has upped the game to where it can now understand audio. But we can see that it does understand what's going on first. These are just samples from the frame I gave for Qwen. So I said that I was struggling with 3 questions, and some of them were quite complex, some of them are kind of banal, but the things that I'm thinking about as I consider all of these images or videos from the kingdom is these questions of semantic scene division, which we were talking about in the morning, a scalable interface for segment examination, which we have, the film cut up into bits. How do we really do our close reading of those scenes while keeping in context some of the quantitative or algorithmic results from our work? And then finally, there's something very specific and peculiar. I'm interested in this case, but I think it's generalizable, and it's about how cultures and peoples who are different from each other relate to each other. So let's start with scene division. There's a lot of ways of cutting up things. If you had a TV commercial for Campbell's Soup, you might say this is 28 seconds. I don't really need to cut this up, just let it be. That's harder with like Night and Fog or something. It's harder with stuff that is a lot longer. You're gonna need to figure out the natural semantic divisions of that video. So if you do bother, if you do wanna cut up your video, there are all sorts of things Python libraries people in this room have worked on or used. PySceneDetect, I learned from Taylor and Lauren's project about Transnet V2, this kind of more deep learning model, which tries to understand where semantic scenes are happening or where there's a lot of pixel change. You can even put all of these strategies together and do an ensemble method. For those of us who rip DVDs, and I know there's at least a couple in this room, you oftentimes get DVD chapters for free. So maybe that's a great solution. Then finally, there's the whole like put my RA on the problem, which is to do the human curated scene distinctions. DVD chapters, at least for the kingdom, are useless. Every scene is between 6 and 12 minutes. I have no idea why these are here. I think they're for commercials in other markets. That's useless. You could say, we'll just use PySceneDetect, and I think that's wrong. It's not going to work for the kingdom for 2 reasons. These are scenes extracted, and you can see these look like almost the same scene, and you'll see why here. I'm going to pay you about 10 or 15 seconds of one of the orderlies who is catches sight of something strange happening on a security camera in the hospital while he's feeding his dog. And one of the things you'll be able to see even now is that there's this rapid cutting, and it's not like A-B shot or whatever. It's like, and it's not, if you watch Hours of the Kingdom, you'll see it's not even like linear in time. Time goes backwards. Has anybody ever seen Olympiad by Leni Riefenstahl, right? And some parts of that were actually filmed in reverse. And you don't notice because it's just so aesthetic, right? So time sometimes moves backwards in von Trier. And so it's not clear you'd actually get a linear sequence of these things. We could throw all of these things together with ensemble methods, and I did that. And then I built a little visualizer here to try to show what was my ensembles helping to collapse. Because the issue with dogma, or at least with this dogma, is that it's too granular. And so you can see some of my ensemble methods at the bottom left. I think as I do this in a second, you'll see these two green ones came together. That's not enough. Like the scene is not just combining two separate scenes. It needs to be way more. So at this point, I just gave up and started going in with a tool, a video editor, and deciding that there were 52 semantic scenes. And what's kind of cool about that is I could then share my EDL, my edit decision list on GitHub. Somebody else could take that work. And there are one or two real edge cases in which it's really hard to make a decision about that. Some of the data suggests there's actually really long shots. I mean, one continuous shot for 30 seconds feels like a lot in von Trier, and they're there. And there's also like really long scenes of 4 minutes. This is an example of an edge case. We start with the son of the boss of the hospital, and then we go to the zombie. It's a long story. You have to watch the TV. So what you'll see here is that is this actually like one scene or two? Hard to say. I think at this point, I'm just going to hand curate my scenes. That's what makes sense for me. Luckily, von Trier had quality, not quantity. The second point I want to talk about, and this is just a very small point, but I think it might be generalizable to a lot of what we're building, is this notion of what Kari Berna from Indiana University has called sort of macroscopes, and we almost talk about scale interfaces. We're able to do the close reading and the big extraction of the patterns. This is something I want to show. This goes back a long time. I was working at University of Chicago with Yuri Sivian, who's a film scholar there, and Yuri is kind of like Mr. Shot length detection, like that's his bag. And so since he did that so well, I got interested in other metrics, and here we're sort of in the Lev Manovich era. And so I was kind of thinking about like measuring just luminosity. You could measure color, you could measure entropy, Shannon entropy, doesn't matter. And thinking about that, but trying to diagnose that and figure out why. Is this moment in the Battleship Potemkin movie, the Odessa Steppe sequence, why is this the whitest if we're measuring just mean luminosity? This is a very clumsy measurement. And the answer is because somebody's opening an umbrella right to the camera. So this red peak here, this orange peak right under my mouse, is exactly correlated with this umbrella opening up into the camera. And that was helpful to me. And although very few of us are using luminosity as the main metric of our cinemetrics today, I still think that if you imagine, take out the luminosity metric and put in like percentage of face in frame, or like loudness of soundtrack, or amount of violins, or stress on people's faces, whatever thing you guys do, if we can think about interfaces where you're able to see not just the particular frame with a histogram here, but also this time series, the dark moments, of course, being where it's an intertitle. I think that's helpful, and I think we should extend that. These are, of course, very parasitic on Tufte's notion of spark lines. They're not in line with the text, but they are there to not allow you to, it all should be relative, and it just kind of let you have a generous interface to scrub backwards and forwards in what you're looking at. And the final thing I'm going to talk about, and that which is going to be the bulk of it, is this notion of film or narrative TV shows in which there is conflict that is, if not racialized, at least expressed in the terms of in-group, out-group, or xenophobia. And that turns out to be sort of the story of our time. But it also has I think this is something people are thinking about. People are taking Korean because they're hearing words in K-pop Demon Hunters, and they want to know what those words are, what they mean. Netflix's own like publicity has like the words you need to know. There's actually, I think people in this room can validate this, there's an uptick in Korean learners. This is really interesting. And that is not a movie that's in Korean, or at least it isn't in the way it's shown in the United States and North America. It's in English with Korean sprinkled in. And in fact, this same international aspect at a much smaller level is part of the story of Liv. It is set in Copenhagen, in the capital of Denmark, which is where the yellow arrow is pointing to. But one of the main characters is a foreigner. He's a Swede who goes across the bridge to come work in Copenhagen. He's from the south of Sweden, so he's from a city called Lund. And there should be absolutely no problems with him coming to work in a neighboring country. In fact, the three Scandinavian languages are of course, mutually intelligible. They're better described as a dialect continuum. The reason that we call Chinese one language and Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian three languages are political, not linguistic. And so, especially when written, but even in orally performed, these are things that everybody can understand. And so that is reflected a lot, or at least discussions around that are reflected in the And what we learn is that there can be difficulties. Even people who are very similar to each other can have difficulties in this sort of very close connection. The most famous scene in probably all of Liet is where Helmer, the Swede, is standing on the roof of the hospital, giving us insight into his everyday working relationship with the Danes. And that's reflected on the left side as well. But more than just jokes, these notions of national difference advance the plot in the kingdom. So somebody who's trying to get a good grade on a medical exam tells the Swedish doctor, yeah, I'm learning Swedish, and we get to see some truly awful Swedish performance by him as he tries to suck up to the main examiner, the external examiner. You know something's gotten real when Stellan Skarsgård shows up as your defense attorney because he botched a brain surgery, and he starts talking about we need a Swedish defense strategy of hide from the process server. So these things come in, and the dialogue is in different languages. And the character of these folks is also a part of the linguistic relationship. This is the heated discussion among the main Danish and the main Swedish doctor around differences in national behavior. So if this is going on kind of at a humoristic level, it's also going on at a very serious level with Kingdom, because essentially what I think von Trier is doing is suggesting that our failure to communicate as humans, even when we can, is essentially a crisis of sort of solidarity of the notions that have built the social democratic welfare state. This is a scene I decided not to play for you guys because it's quite disturbing and involves an actor playing a brain-damaged child. But I think this is the reason why von Trier is focusing on this, is that he's creating a horror movie. He's creating a horror series of TV shows. It's about the things we cannot recognize, we say are impossible, or that are inhuman, that are uncanny. And the way he introduces that concept is to sort of introduce the narcissism of small differences between people who are actually very much the same. And so what this shows up in really interesting ways in the sonic and the soundtrack and in the sort of what's spoken in Liet. And this is what I sort of call mid-phrasal code switching. This is all in Nordic languages. Here, a color-coded blue is Swedish and red is Danish. And you'll see that the doctor who's botched an operation is coming to talk to the mother of the child. And Helmer actually has to switch. Basically, as you saw on this other slide, the mother refuses to speak to him. And so basically, Helmer has to call a nurse to translate. And so it's this completely preposterous idea that you have a translator in the room speaking a very similar language. It's like something from Monty Python, but it's part of this refusal to see each other as human. And what's interesting about this is you could say, okay, what if we're trying to find other instances of this? Because there are other instances. There's the Danish doctor who's trying to get a good grade, who like performs Swedish with the doctor so he gets a better grade. The problem is it's really hard to find. The Danish subtitles translate everything into Danish. The Swedish do the same in the reverse. So trying to find this computationally is really difficult, at least with the subtitles. You could do it sonically. But can you do it sonically? Can you do it with automatic speech recognition? No, it's really hard. The actual script, this is a focus on the very first line of that longer list I gave you, and I've indicated where language change occurs. If Helmer had stayed in Swedish, he wouldn't have said min accent, he would have said min brytning. And yet he doesn't, he switches to Danish. And so I've parsed this at many different levels with Whisper and asked it to figure out what languages are being spoken. And tragically, the minute it grabs onto a spoken language, it thinks that's it for the entire chunk. And so Whisper, right after the clown face, starts representing all his spoken Danish as phonetic Swedish, right? Which is sort of the right thing to do, but the wrong thing if you're trying to generate sort of hard-coded linguistic tags. So these are kind of a conclusion to some of the things I'm thinking about as I'm getting ready to apply these multimodal models, whether they're Pose or Sonic or all the interesting things we want to think about, ASR like Whisper, automatic speech recognition. I've decided that for now I need to hand curate this corpus. It's not a huge corpus. I think it's going to pay dividends in trying to think about these semantic scenes. I think I want to go back to the work I did in 2011 and rethink about sort of scrubbable spark lines, or not for luminosity, but for presence of Swedish Danish or like amount of color in the scene or whatever. And then finally, just to go to this notion of how we're going to solve code switching, linguistic code switching, or cultural conflict. We're going to need a lot of different methods for this. I haven't tried NVIDIA Parakeet, which is kind of like a competitor to Whisper. You could try more granular chunking. With mid-phrasal code switching, you'd have to chunk at every single word. It's such an interesting problem. And this notion of could we build something, a word embedding model that understands sort of like brotherly fights between Scandinavians, that would be a great example of a fine tune, right? Because the Danish doctor is able to eviscerate Helmer by just uttering one word, which is crayfish, when Helmer says that they're more dignified in Sweden. So we need these fine tunes that can pick up on these things and that are able to apply not just to Ria, but to things all over the place. All right, I'll leave you with a word from Lars von Trier, which is that we have to take the good with the evil when it comes to multiple models. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Peter, and really one of my favorite film and television series, and a really great addition to that. It'll be really fun. I always think of von Trier and the whole Dogma group as a fundamental challenge to anything that we might try to do, just in general as people, but also computationally. We do actually have somewhere around 12 minutes for questions, and those could be both on Peter's talk, but also on Pete's talk, also on James and Haoyang's talk. After we finish up here, we're going to, if people need to use the restrooms, they're here. And then we'll sort of congregate out in the common area there, and I'll walk you up to South Hall, so nobody gets lost or nobody dies of heat exhaustion. This for us is totally absurd. But I'm going to throw open the floor to questions and answers.
Well, I just thought I'd ask, since you mentioned the three sort of what's the triangle of Mercer, silent hill, and the office? Would it be interesting, and how would you try to do it if you were to actually like position scenes from the kingdom within those signposts in some kind of embedding space?
Right. Yeah. One of the interesting things about the kingdom, watching it, and you're American, I don't watch a lot of European TV, like older women, like women over the age of 50, are like a core focus of the kingdom. And that's so interesting. And just like for Murder, She Wrote. But one point, Fludlusa involves many other psychics in her effort to kind of like find out what's going on in the hospital. And I think it's just really interesting to see that kind of representation of folks. These aren't people, these are well-known actors, but they're not people who star in like James Bond films. And so it would be interesting to think about. There's other elements of the kingdom which are just, when I went into watching this, I thought, I'm not sure I can handle this. I don't like horror films. This was so much worse than anything I ever could have imagined. It's really amazing. And what's really interesting about the horror in there, in terms of Silent Hill, is it's not just the horror film, it's also the brain surgery. Like there's a lot of, I think one of the points von Trier is trying to make is that there's a lot of the visceral in the most clinical brain surgery, right? But that's an interesting point around that. And I think it also reflects my hesitation to consider 2022 the kingdom exodus, which I know there's mixed opinions on, but many of the actors had changed because some had passed away. So that would be interesting. Actually, I'd love to do it internally first to think about the three sort of elements of the kingdom and how they're self-similar or not.
I think that it's kind of an interesting thing. When I think of these spaces, I often think of orthogonal dimensions. And for Danish, one of the dimensions that seems so functional is the hygge, uhygge dimension. And von Trier is definitely playing along this. You've all heard of hyggelig. Hyggelig is coziness and things like that. It's the epitome of what you want things to be in Denmark. And uhyggelig is about the worst things can possibly be. So hygge, uhygge is this incredibly powerful dimension in Danish culture. There was a question back here.
Point is about the intermedia question, and like speaking a little bit more about what you mean by intermedia versus like intermedia or intermedia, and then there's multimedia, and that's kind of comes from like the Fluxus history. I was curious. I haven't heard intermedia used in a while, so I was curious what the article incorporated that or what's happening there. And then I have a question for all of the TV shows.
Okay, just briefly, yeah, it is a loaded term. It's actually one younger friend of our collaborators in the music department chose to use based on their own interests. I don't know if they were. I mean, they were aware of various media theoretical uses of the term, but I think they were sort of trying to redefine it as this term that is nebulous enough that you could redefine it in the context of the notion. Because there's a notion that there are all these different performance traditions that are being unified in the performance, but the way that now works is that it's when there are moments of unity, they're supposed to sort of become maps, but also be engineered. So I think it was partially a decent setting. We're going to use this term. But I think so. I mean, does that make it useful for any other comparisons? About notions of Wagnerian notions of human. I don't be something to look at. Maybe some LLM could probably give you write you an essay about that.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat the questions from the audience because they're not getting picked up on Zoom. But go ahead.
And then I was gonna ask about the TV show looking back. So like you mentioned that like we never certain age of the audience and it would seem I mean like maybe share a little more about like who's watching it and where and when and what time because if it's like TV at 6 o'clock on physical television as you go from physical TV to streaming, your audience is gonna probably be what they consider the average person or average who's the biggest watcher, usually the biggest watcher of TV by the late 2000s on TV, which we know now, 2010 is going to be usually older, with women at home, domestic sphere. That's like so. I'm just wondering if that's
So the question is about audience here and who is watching via and perhaps some sort of gender bias towards a time of transmission, the time that it was broadcast.
That's a great question from your article.
Yes.
I read the sites because Tim quotes there's this interesting debate of was this the most important event in Danish TV history? And it's probably one of the top 5 or top 10. It depends, like our sporting teams things where people kicking a ball around at a world thing. Is that count or are we only interested in narrative stuff? But it's a great question. We also remember this was in the 90s. It was dark in the 1990s in terms of channel access and stuff like that. So I think you'd need a real media historian in Denmark, but luckily those studies have been written. And this, I think, for the Danes in the room, this was an important thing in Danish TV history. Anytime Stephen King calls you up and it's like, I want to remake this, it means that it's spread outside that little country.
Yeah. Great. Ali, thank you.
Thanks. I have a question for the speaker. I was intrigued by what you said about the code switching and the crayfish example. Would it work? Have you thought about or looked into methods for irony detection or like satire detection?
Yeah, that's a great.
So the question is, have you looked at methods for irony detection, which I think is deeply ironic when you're working with Danish stuff. But
right.
Go ahead, Peter.
What a good question. I think that whenever I've looked into this, it's been like my lay understanding is that it is not yet solved, but I think very important if people want to correct me on this. But just to return, that question is really important. What if we could produce, I think we will need fine-tuned irony detection models for cultural contexts. And to return to one of the things we were talking about this morning, and multilingual, good news, we have multilingual clip. Bad news, it's all Google translated. And so that creates all sorts of problems, as Peter Broadwell and others who work with multilinguals can know. So I think the Nordic national libraries need to produce not just fine-tunes, but ground-up retrainings of these models for that are based in the national camp.
Great. There's an online question about scene detection and animation, and whether or not am I getting it right, Lily?
Yeah. Would it be more straightforward? Would this be more straightforward to process?
Would it be more straightforward to process these kinds of challenges working with animation? And of course, this goes back to the Leonard, Lars von Trier, Die Filmspin, because one of them is, of course, the obstruction that he has to do an animated film And another one is that he has to do it with no shot longer than, was it 0.3 seconds?
Yeah, it's up
0.3
there.
seconds. So
It's
they're
perfect
very
for-
interesting things.
For TikTok. I think what the question has made me think of is what we need is dogma cartoons on Saturday morning, which would be fantastic. Yeah, the good news is that an amazing amount of people out there working on anime and stuff like that who would know far more about this than I do. But I think you're right that it is genre specific to this